A rescue team is trapped with monsters on an abandoned ship.
Checkmate.
The space surveillance ship Academician Vladislav Volkov is in the southern regions of the Pacific Ocean. The crew is establishing contact with the manned scientific research orbital station Mir. Once connected, Nadia Vinogradova, who is in charge of the mission, requests the astronauts to transmit the collected data for further study. Nadia, who knows how to balance work and relaxation, manages to play a game of chess with one of the astronauts and share some tender moments with her husband, the ship's captain. Meanwhile, a woman on the station notices a strange object approaching at high speed. She takes a photo and asks her colleagues to look through the porthole to identify the unknown object. Its nature and structure are unclear, but it visually resembles a cluster of electromagnetic pulses that suddenly pierce the station. Video and radio contact with the station is lost, and during brief connections, the astronauts call for help. Seconds later, data transmission from the station to the ship begins, during which something infiltrates the vessel and starts hacking the main computer, trying to crack the access code. The ship's commander finds it impossible, but the entity takes control of the systems. The crew is on the brink of survival and becomes hostage to an unknown force that has taken over the main computer. 7 days later, a small tugboat called Sea Star finds itself in roughly the same region. The crew has deviated from their usual route and ends up in a typhoon. Foster reports that wind speeds are increasing and they might be caught in a hurricane. Captain Everton orders a change of course to sail against the wind, believing this will keep them afloat and prevent them from becoming victims of the storm. Noticing that the barge they are towing is rapidly taking on water, Foster reports it to the captain, but he refuses to take additional action, believing their ship has endured worse conditions. During another attempt to change course, a huge wave crashes over the ship. It not only damages the hull of the Sea Star but also breaks the mast, blocking access to the deck. Part of the superstructure is damaged, allowing water to flood the engine room. Realizing the situation is critical, engineer Steve Baker asks the crew to cut the door open with a blowtorch, as it's the only way to reach the deck and protect the engine room. With the crew's situation worsening by the second, Foster plots a course into the eye of the typhoon. Inside this zone, they will have a few hours of respite to repair the ship and prepare for the next storm. On the bridge, Steve urges the captain to jettison the barge, as its weight could drag them down like an anchor. Everton vehemently refuses, wanting to deliver the barge to port for the reward. Steve is ready to detach the barge, but the captain threatens him with a revolver. Their argument is cut short when another huge wave hits the ship, breaking the chain and sending the barge to the bottom. Foster and Steve see this as a victory, as they could have sunk with it. Everton, having spent all his savings on the barge, feels devastated. Reluctant to give orders, he agrees to head into the cyclone center and locks himself in his cabin. At dawn, Everton drinks heavily and contemplates ending his life with a game of Russian roulette. The crew tries to revive the ship and patch all the holes, pumping water out of the engine room. After welding and checking the hull, they conclude that the Sea Star is at its limit and probably won't survive another typhoon. The crew loses hope as they only have a few days of food and water left. Suddenly, Foster brings a glimmer of hope, reporting that there's a ship 12 miles away that isn't moving. Determining it's a large, heavy vessel, Foster tries to contact its crew but gets only silence in return. Everton soon learns about the stationary ship, giving him new hope and a will to live. As they get closer, Woods tries to establish contact again but to no avail. From a few hundred yards away, the crew spots overturned lifeboats and then the huge ship they belong to. Getting closer, Foster identifies the ship as Russian, the Academician Vladislav Volkov, a satellite and missile tracking ship equipped with parabolic antennas, modern laboratories, and robotic workshops. A few meters from the vessel, Everton makes one last attempt to contact the crew using a loudspeaker. When no one responds, he asks Steve to bring climbing gear, flashlights, and other tools so they can board and investigate. A few minutes later, everyone except Woods boards the Academician Vladislav Volkov. Steve and Squeaky go ahead and notice numerous bullet holes, realizing something terrible happened here. The bridge is empty, which pleases Everton. The power is out, and the radio is broken. The logbook is no help to the international crew since no one understands Russian. The situation excites the crew and the captain because they can tow the ship to the nearest port. According to maritime law, a ship abandoned in international waters belongs to whoever finds it, so nothing stands in the way of their plan. The ship is worth about $300 million, meaning they'd get a hefty compensation. The captain promises to be fair and generous, giving each crew member $3 million in cash. Foster is less optimistic, reminding everyone that easy money rarely comes without a catch. She also points out that the ship isn't technically abandoned if there's even one survivor on board. To her horror, Everton isn't bothered by this and is willing to eliminate any survivor to secure the potential payout. After giving orders, the captain prepares the ship for towing, but first, they need to restore power to start the turbine engines. Steve and Squeaky head to the engine room to get the equipment running. The control panel is broken, and the relays are ripped out, but the engineer and his assistant quickly fix the problem and restore power. As soon as they do, the central computer and robots in the workshop come online. The electrical wiring suffers from a short circuit, producing a terrifying sound. But the most alarming thing is that the surveillance cameras are operating autonomously. Foster warns the captain that someone is controlling the computer, but he dismisses it as impossible. After tracking the location of the towing ship, something drops a massive anchor and pierces it. Hiko is injured and in bad shape, but Woods refuses to rescue him, thinking his own life is more important. Foster wants to jump in and help her colleague, but the captain forbids her from taking the risk. Steve, who is always clashing with Everton, leaves Squeaky in the engine room and rushes to help. After pulling the wounded Hiko from the water, Steve tells Squeaky to lock himself in, suspecting there's someone else on board causing sabotage. After the last incident and the sinking of the tugboat, Steve questions Everton's role, but the captain suggests they forget their differences to achieve their common goal. Understanding they need to split up, Woods and Richie are ordered to go to the engine room and help Squeaky. The captain, Foster, and Steve search for the medical station to treat Hiko's wound. Meanwhile, small robots start coming to life and crawling around the ship, but the crew ignores it. Squeaky is the first to notice something strange when he sees a cable being pulled into a pipe. Trying to figure out what's going on, Squeaky follows the robot into a tangle of wires, where he is suddenly attacked and disappears. Woods and Richie find an armory and decide to upgrade their gear in case of conflicts on their way to port. Descending a bit further, they discover a missile launch shaft and 2 catapults for emergency evacuation. Woods is frightened by all the blood around, but Richie is confident they can handle any enemy. Meanwhile, Foster is stitching up Hiko's leg, discussing what they'll do with the money. Hiko dreams of opening schools for children in poor countries. Steve wants to buy an island and invite Foster to join him, but the navigator isn't used to dreaming, doubting they'll ever get the money. At one point, Steve opens a medicine cabinet, and suddenly, a person wearing a gas mask emerges and starts shooting wildly, nearly killing the whole crew. Steve quickly neutralizes the threat, discovering that the shooter is Nadia, the only surviving member of the Russian ship's crew. This revelation disappoints Everton. Steve tries to contact Squeaky, but there's no response. Realizing something's wrong, he heads to the engine room and orders Richie and Woods to follow. On their way, the 2 crew members encounter a robot and, terrified, shoot at it in a desperate attempt to defend themselves. Waking up, a frantic Nadia begs them to cut the power as quickly as possible to prevent the entity from moving. She explains that the rest of the crew didn't survive the energy attack that came from the Mir station, using gas to kill people, but some managed to escape on lifeboats. No one believes her crazy story except Foster. Deciding to act fast, Nadia shoves the captain aside and runs off to cut the power. Grabbing an axe, she heads for the cables, but Foster stops her. Nadia pleads with her not to interfere, insisting that the entity is using electricity for its own purposes and no one will survive. Hiko ties her up to prevent her from posing a threat to the rest of the crew. Woods and Richie find a lab filled with robots. They cut the power, but a short circuit restores the working process. As they begin to examine the room more closely, one of the robots attacks them, injuring Woods with nails. Another robot appears and starts shooting at them, but they manage to hide and warn Steve of the danger via radio. When Steve arrives at the engine room, he tries to open the door, but it's welded shut, and Squeaky is nowhere to be found. Soon, Richie and the injured Woods arrive as well. They realize something strange is happening when a robot suddenly attacks them, opening fire. Working together, Steve and the team disable the robot by cutting its power wires. Everton suspects that Nadia is behind the sabotage on the ship and threatens her with a revolver, demanding to know where Squeaky is hidden. Foster realizes that Nadia couldn't be responsible since she's been hiding in the medical bay the entire time. Although Everton and Hiko remain distrustful of Nadia, she insists they need to cut the power to stop the alien energy from terrorizing them. Soon, the rest of the crew arrives on the bridge, bringing the remains of a robot. Nadia is horrified to recognize her husband, Alexei, in the robot's remains. Squeaky is still missing, and the crew is confused, but Foster asks Nadia to finish her story, increasingly believing in its reality. Nadia explains that the energy corrupted the main computer, navigation, and other electronic systems, completely taking control of the ship. Initially, the system began building scavenger robots, followed by biomechanical creatures made from human parts. When the surviving crew members abandoned the ship, Alexei and Nadia decided to stay and cut all power cables, but it seems her husband was caught by the robots and became part of a biomechanical entity. To verify Nadia's story, Richie examines the biomechanical creature and finds an electronic implant in its brain sustaining its life. Suddenly, the robot grabs Nadia's hand, but Steve finishes it off with the butt of his rifle. Everton remains skeptical, suggesting that there are no aliens and what they see is the result of failed experiments by the Russians to combat external threats. Soon, the ship encounters a storm, and the crew needs to change course to avoid sinking. The robot made from Alexei's body reanimates, but Richie puts it down with several well-placed shots. Realizing the danger, the crew rushes to leave the ship as quickly as possible. Descending to a lower deck, they notice that the alien energy has intelligence and is altering the course to preserve the ship. Heading to the engine room, they hear knocking behind the door. Peeking inside, Steve claims he sees Squeaky, but the others are hesitant to open the door, fearing something dreadful lurks behind it. Squeaky breaks through the door, now a hostile biomechanical entity. He grabs Woods and lifts him up, only to be killed by a giant robot following behind Squeaky. Firing back and fleeing, the crew takes shelter in the communications room. Richie tries to call for help, but Everton destroys the radio, declaring that it's his ship and he doesn't need competitors for the reward money. Furious, Foster punches the captain and frees Nadia. Meanwhile, a robot is attempting to break through the walls and is about to burst in. Realizing this, Richie decides to communicate with the computer controlled by the unknown life form. The team learns that the hostile energy views humanity as a virus and intends to exterminate them, using human parts as building material. After a quick discussion, the team concludes that the best way to prevent disaster and stop the alien energy from spreading is to sink the ship. Richie refuses to be a victim of the robots, so he shoots the biobot Squeaky and separates from the main group. While the team leaves to try and shut down the main computer, Everton doesn't join them. Instead, he makes contact with the entity, offering to take it to New Zealand or Australia in exchange for his life. Heading to the workshop, Everton meets with a robot and strikes a deal. The team reaches their destination and realizes that the entity has moved the main computer elsewhere. They are then attacked by a large robot, but Nadia, Foster, Steve, and Hiko manage to escape. On the deck, Nadia suggests going to the antenna targeting hall, believing it to be the safest place. During the storm, Foster falls from the ladder, but Hiko saves her, sacrificing himself as he is swept overboard. While Richie prepares an explosive device and fends off small robots, Foster and Nadia figure out that the alien intelligence is steering them towards an island where British intelligence is located. Understanding the need to prevent the spread of the biomechanical organisms, they devise a plan to sink the ship. Soon, they are contacted by a nearby ship, but Steve decides not to respond to avoid leading the alien energy to it. Soon, the trio is found by Everton, who has become a biobot but retains his consciousness. Foster shoots him but inflicts little damage. Realizing their enemy's strength, Nadia uses a thermobaric grenade, and Steve pushes Everton out of the room, where he is ultimately killed. Planning to set the explosives and fill the ship with fuel, the trio encounters Richie and warns him of their plan. Armed and deranged, Richie no longer acts as part of the team and sticks to his own plan. Filling the ship with fuel and setting a timed explosive device for 15 minutes, the team prepares to evacuate, but a giant sentient robot attacks them. Trapped, Steve and Nadia fall and lose consciousness. Foster falls into a sea of fuel and bodies but is captured by the robot, which then interrogates her using electroshock. Several minutes later, Steve and Nadia attack the robot but inflict little damage. Unexpectedly, Richie joins them and fires a grenade launcher at the robot, freeing Foster. The robot retaliates, collapsing part of the metal structure and leaving the men in a precarious position while Nadia and Foster manage to escape. Hiding behind several metal doors, the women find diving suits and prepare for evacuation as time runs out. Steve dismantles the metal structure and finds a wounded Richie. Before dying, Richie reveals critical information about the missile silo and catapult, which could help them quickly escape the ship. Nadia and Foster are ready to jump into the water when they encounter the giant robot again. It has found and destroyed the detonator, thwarting their initial plan. Realizing they cannot escape, Nadia urges Foster to flee and pushes her into an adjacent room. Allowing herself to be grabbed by the robot, Nadia promises to reveal the locations of the remaining detonators. Sacrificing herself, she shoots at gas cylinders, causing a massive explosion that only slightly damages the robot. It continues to pursue Foster, who is then found by Steve. The pair heads to the missile silo as Richie had advised. Once there, Steve straps Foster into the catapult and prepares it for launch. The robot approaches, and Steve plans to sacrifice himself heroically to ensure Foster's survival. As the giant robot breaches the missile silo, Foster straps Steve to her and activates the device. They successfully launch from the ship, the catapult tethered to a cable with grenades left by Richie. The catapult pulls the pin, leading to a massive explosion that completely destroys the ship, noticed by a nearby vessel. By morning, a helicopter arrives to rescue the survivors. Foster spots Hiko and tries to check if he is alive, but a man with a disfigured face attacks her. She awakens to realize it was just a horrific dream, with Steve comforting her, assuring her that it's all over and they have defeated the evil entity that had taken over the Russian ship. According to the latest data, AI developers are ready to introduce intelligent robots that can largely replace humans within the next few decades. Do you think these robots will be hostile towards us, potentially leading to a war with machines, or will we continue to control them, remaining masters of our own fate? Share your thoughts in the comments below, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.